Okay. So, lecture number 11. Did anybody else pass that sheep driving a pickup truck this morning? Did anybody else pass that sheep driving a pickup truck this morning? Nobody? I was coming in from 72. I got up to County Bank, headed on to Reynolds, and I pulled up next to a sheep driving a pickup truck at the stoplight. Never seen that. You guys may have seen that, but I've never seen that before. So I kind of motioned to the sheep. I did this thing, roll down your window, and the sheep used his little hoof to roll down the window. And I said, "Sheep, what are you doing driving a pickup truck? Do you have a license?" And the sheep said, "Bah." I don't know. I said, "I don't know what that means. I don't know what that means, but even if you do have a license, you ought not be driving a pickup truck. You ought to be driving a Lamborghini." And it got kind of ticked off at me and screeched its wheels off down Reynolds Avenue, and about 100 yards down I saw it crash into a telephone pole. Mm-hmm. It wasn't badly hurt, but I rolled up to it and I rolled my window down and I said, "Hey sheep, do you need me to call you a ambulance?" Nobody else saw that sheep, huh? All right. Well, here we go. If you remember last class, oh, well, you would if you could. If you remember last class, we had just watched the British military gun down 5 civilians in the Boston Massacre. There is a poster made by the Sons of Liberty to let people know that this had been done. The grammar is not so great. There are 5 coffins. 4 were killed on the spot. 1 died a day or 2 later as a result of complications, including the African-American apprentice, Crispus Attucks. He was out there protesting too. So 5 coffins on the death of 5 young men who was murdered. March 5th, 1770, by the 29th Regiment. So the Sons of Liberty cared deeply about constitutional issues, but not so much about grammar. So you've got a little noun-verb agreement issue there. But the British knew they had done something very bad, killing those 5 civilians, and they tried to calm things down a bit. Number 1, they pulled those soldiers out of Boston. Those 2,000 British soldiers were redeployed back where they originally started from, down to, I believe, New York. So they pulled the soldiers out of Boston to calm things down, and recognizing that the people of Boston had been rioting and protesting in the first place over the Townshend Acts, those import duties / taxes / tariffs that the British had placed on lots of manufacturing goods, manufactured products going into the American colonies, recognizing that the Townshend Acts were a source of irritation, they repealed, took back, discontinued the Townshend Acts, all except for one product. I'll bet you'll never guess. Oh, you already guessed it? Tea. They left the tax on tea, just to make the point that if they wanted to tax something, they could. And so Americans became laser focused. I'm doing a binocular motion. That's not laser. Became highly focused on tea. and they appointed a new prime minister. That's the word that you've got kind of missing behind the camera there, Prime. Lord North, new prime minister. The prime minister, then as today, nowadays he's the leader of the government. He was the leader of the House of Commons in this day and age. You ready for the next one? I always ask that when I'm recording for YouTube because if I go back, it erases everything when I'm recording directly to the PowerPoint. So bear with me. There is a picture of Lord North. Conveniently for us, he was the prime minister all the way through the American Revolution, so he's the only one you need to remember until they lose. 1770 to 1782. I know people say not to do this. People say not to judge a book by its cover. But let's do. What's your first impression of Lord North? He has a big forehead, wealthy. What are some other impressions? He has a big double chin. So these are not entirely positive. How about now? Kind of scary. How about now? A mean chin. I suspect a number of young ladies in the classroom are secretly swooning, I say, over the handsome profile of Lord North. Well, to my eye, he doesn't look like the sharpest knife, if you've ever heard that expression. He was perfectly capable. But what the British needed at this moment in their history was someone really far-sighted and wise. Because, a lot of things were happening between the mother country and its colonies. Lord North might have been just fine as prime minister during ordinary times, but he was not necessarily the man for this moment. Welcome. Things started to calm down a little bit, but Lord North was worried about some of his rich friends. I don't know if it comes across in the images, but he was raised in the lap of luxury, wealthy. He had well-connected, high-powered friends, many of them in the British East India Company, the company most involved in shipping tea to the American colonies, and they were not getting as rich as they were hoping. They were getting rich, but not as rich as they wished to be. So Lord North began thinking, what could he do as prime minister to make sure his rich friends got richer a little more rapidly? And his answer was the Tea Act of 1773, which lowered the tax on tea. Lord North could not imagine how anybody could get angry over a lower tax. But Americans did, and the cartoon you're looking at is one reason. I promised you 3 drawings by Paul Revere. That would get increasingly radical. The first one was 1768, when the British soldiers were first shipped into Boston. And that one, if you remember, was very accurate. Paul Revere drew the Boston harbor, the wharfs, the docks, the British warships, the skyline, just as it would have appeared. The British arriving. It's a political moment, but a very accurate portrait. Then 1770, he drew a picture of the Boston Massacre, which most of you guys agreed took a few liberties with the truth. So he drew a picture of the British officer firing when it's not clear at all that there was an order to fire. A picture of the two groups standing far apart when they were actually right up against each other. Now, 1773, we have Paul Revere really swimming to the deep end of the cartoon swimming pool with an extremely radical cartoon. The woman you see on the ground with her dress pulled down to her waist, being held down, as it turns out, by two of Lord North's cabinet ministers, is identified in the title here as America, the American colonies. The title of the cartoon is The Able Doctor, or America Swallowing the Bitter Draught. The bitter draught being tea. This figure up here is holding a teapot and forcing it into the mouth of America. Do you recognize the political figure here? That's him. Yep. He had a very recognizable face and political and profile. That's Lord North. That's the Prime Minister. He's the one who guided the Tea Act through the House of Commons. And there he is with the teapot, forcing the tea into America's mouth. And if you look closely, you can see America spitting the tea back up in his face. Can you see that? So what you have here is a molestation scene. America is being molested by these British politicians. It's a pretty radical way to depict what is at bottom a tax law. It's a lower tax, but Paul Revere has drawn it as an assault. And just to continue the impression, this is one of Lord North's ministers, the Earl of Sandwich. He's holding down America's ankles here, and while he's got America in a vulnerable position, you can see he's taking that opportunity to lift up her skirt and look under her skirt. So Paul Revere drew it this way to make Americans angry about a tax law that they might not have been that upset about all by itself. It's one of a number of ways that Paul Revere and others managed to keep Americans upset over the issue of taxation and tea. And it worked quite well. Americans, when they saw this image, were enraged, became angry. The feeling was that the lower tax was a trick, a way of baiting the hook, and getting Americans to bite, go ahead and buy the tea, pay the tax, and in the process agree with unconstitutional taxation without representation. And before saying goodbye to this cartoon, let me just quickly point out this woman up here shielding her eyes. We in the United States have a female persona, the Statue of Liberty. She was frequently known as Columbia in American history. The British had a female persona for the British Empire, known as Britannia. So that is Britannia, the female persona for the entire British Empire. And she has her head in her hands as if to say, oh my God, I can't believe they're doing this to my poor colonies. I can't believe my empire has come to this. So it's a very adept rendering. When those tea ships arrived in American ports, they found the Sons of Liberty standing on the docks waiting for them in a rather threatening posture in most American ports. The Sons of Liberty were determined not to let that tea be carried off the tea ships. And in most ports, this is the way it happened in South Carolina down in Charleston. They didn't change it from Charlestown to Charleston until after the American Revolution, so Charlestown. But in South Carolina, the tea ships sailed in. The Sons of Liberty were standing there, ready to go into action if they tried to carry that tea off the ship and onto the dock and into a warehouse. And so the tea ship turned around and left because the ship owner didn't want to risk damage to his ship or damage to his cargo. They turned around and sailed out. This is one small part of the story that you miss, or that's oftentimes overlooked. If you remember that picture of Lieutenant Governor Thomas Hutchinson's house with the Sons of Liberty sitting on the roof, prying up his roofing tiles, carrying his furniture out the front door to burn it in the front yard, throwing his papers out the windows. Well, Lieutenant Governor Thomas Hutchinson in Boston. This is why it happened in Boston and no place else. He was so peeved, so tired of the Sons of Liberty pushing people around and doing stuff, he would not let the tea ship sail away. He told them to tie up at the dock and unload that tea at the first opportunity. So there developed in Boston a standoff between the Sons of Liberty, who would not move, and the tea ship, which was not allowed to sail away. Late November, December. Finally, in December, you guys know this story, I think, perfectly well. The Sons of Liberty decided to take action. December 16th, they went on board the tea ship and cracked open those chests of tea and dumped them over the side of the ship into the water. Everybody knew who they were, and you can see in the background of this drawing several hundred people standing on the dock watching. It was not a clandestine secret operation. People knew what they were doing. It was a form of entertainment, and I guess. But a huge amount of tea was destroyed, and the British government was in a position of having to do something about it. They tried to arrest the perpetrators, but of course nobody recognized anybody. Even though there were several hundred people watching the whole thing, nobody could identify any of the Sons of Liberty who were operating. So the British House of Commons passed some laws. Punishment for the city of Boston. The four laws together were known as the coercive acts, trying to force Boston to give up the people responsible, and of course pay back the value of the cargo that had been destroyed. Collectively known as the coercive acts in Britain, Americans preferred to call them the intolerable acts. In the spring of 1774. The first one, the Boston Port Act, closed down all shipping coming into and going out of Boston, which was basically an economic death sentence, because that's mostly what Boston was doing. The Massachusetts Governing Act suspended the elected representatives of the people of Massachusetts and instituted military rule. The Administration of Justice Act was rather frightening because the British recognized that even if they identified one of the perpetrators and put him on trial according to the traditional trial by jury of the peers, the people of Boston had proven they were likely not going to convict the Sons of Liberty. So the Administration of Justice Act gave the British the power to grab somebody and take them anywhere they wanted for a military tribunal. So there would be no trial by jury, no habeas corpus. Habeas corpus is the right to be brought before a judge and told what you're being charged with, why you're being held. So someone could be grabbed, taken away without notification, without official charges, either to Canada, Great Britain, the Caribbean. For heaven's sakes, it could be India. Nobody knew. And there would not necessarily be any report of what the consequences were. So that was very frightening. And the Quartering Act, the British, after the Boston Tea Party, again sent soldiers back up to Boston. Several thousand soldiers moved back into Boston. This time they didn't want to just live in tents, though. So the Quartering Act gave them the right to occupy anybody's house that looked attractive to them. And Americans were so angry about this, we now have it written into our Bill of Rights. No quartering of troops in civilian housing. You ready for the next one? Well, even though the coercive acts suspended the Massachusetts elected government, they went to a nearby town of Suffolk. Nowadays it's just a suburb of Boston, but they went to Suffolk and declared that they were still operating as the government of Massachusetts, and they passed a number of resolutions. Most importantly, they all became known as the Suffolk Resolves. They declared that it was time to begin buying guns, ammunition, bullets, and training for possible military conflict with the British. It's not war yet, but it's preparation for possible conflict. Paul Revere got him a copy of those Suffolk Resolves, and he rode down to Philadelphia, where, as chance would have it, are you ready for the next slide? One more minute. As chance would have it, the First Continental Congress was meeting, delegates from all of the colonies. Ready? Spring of 1774, the First Continental Congress. You can see some of them are crouching, they're praying. This is the opening prayer of the First Continental Congress. They thought they were there just to talk about tea. They had traveled from Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, all the way up to Pennsylvania to talk about non-importation, boycotts of tea. And Paul Revere rode up with a copy of the Suffolk Resolves, calling for military preparation. So even though they were there just to talk about not buying tea, to their credit, those delegates at the First Continental Congress talked about the Suffolk Resolves and ultimately agreed to stand with the people of Massachusetts. They adopted the Suffolk Resolves, calling for military preparation. That's a pretty fateful step. But if you read through the transcripts of that First Continental Congress, you will not see one word whispered about independence. They were ready to buy the guns, begin training with the guns, not yet ready to speak openly about independence. Nobody was having conversations about independence. What they wanted was to stay within the British Empire and be recognized as having the rights that English people have under the Constitution. The right to be represented whenever a tax law is passed. So no discussion of independence. You ready? Here comes the flashpoint. The British did not do very much for the rest of 1774 or early 1775. They had those several thousand troops in Boston. But in April, they received information that the Massachusetts militia, the so-called Minutemen, had guns and ammunition in the town of Concord out in the countryside. There's Concord. Here's Boston, surrounded by water. Concord is about a day's march, a day and a half march out into the countryside. Laser pointer, activate. So they set out late at night on the 18th, April 18th, marching towards Concord to try and confiscate that military equipment. And as the sun rose on April 19th, they were passing through the little town of Lexington. I'm going to move my laser pointer right over Lexington. There it is right there. That was not their destination, and they could have marched right past it, but the sun had just come up over the horizon. The mists were still hovering over the fields. They saw in the village green, the central meadow in Lexington, slightly less, I think, than 100, in the neighborhood of 100 Massachusetts militia standing in formation. These are not professional military. These are farmers, were farmers, carpenters, merchants, blacksmiths, ordinary people of Massachusetts who had begun training. There were so few of them, in fact, their commanding officer had told them, standard British military formation is 1 arm's length from the man to your left. Their commanding officer had told them to stand an extra step or two away so they would look more imposing, as if there were more of them standing out there. The British, like I said, could have marched right past, but they chose to stop. And they formed up, a company or two, right in front of those Massachusetts militia. There's an image of it. This is the famous shot heard round the world. There was no official order to fire on the part of the British. But a shot was heard. No one knows where the shot was fired from or who did it. Once the shot was fired, the British, in unison, opened fire. And you can see the results. This is an amateur, untrained. They were doing the best they could, but they were not professional soldiers. Some of them were killed outright. The rest of them ran for it. Some of them died later as a result of injuries. And the British continued marching on up to Concord. Once they got to Concord, they could not find any guns. They had all been moved away. They searched houses, searched warehouses. And when they got to this little bridge, on the other side, those militia had returned. And they had spread the word. Many hundreds more militia, once they heard about what had happened at Lexington, showed up. They exchanged fire. And this time they didn't run away. They stood their ground. And the British decided, rather than battle across that bridge and continue searching a few isolated barns on that side of Concord, probably best to turn around and start heading back to Boston. So the British turned around and headed back. And the rest of that day was a real nightmare for the British. The militia followed them every step of the way. The Massachusetts militia ran alongside the British in the woods on both sides of that little country road, firing, then running forward through the woods. These were single muzzle loader guns. You had to pour your gunpowder in the top of the barrel and drop your bullet in the top and ram it down. They would reload as they ran, get ahead of the column, and as it marched past, they would shoot again, then run forward all the way back to Boston. When the British got back, this is the British figure. They started tending the wounded and counting their dead. The British counted 250 killed during the day's march home. That's not injured. That's just outright dead, killed by the Massachusetts militia. So it was a vicious day, bloody day for the British. And then something interesting happened. As the sun set over the waters around Boston, the British troops, still putting bandages on their wounded, noticed first one twinkling light across the water, then another, then several dozen, and then towards midnight, hundreds of twinkling lights all around Boston. Those were campfires. The militia followed the British all the way back to Boston, and then they did not go home. They encamped all around Boston. And as the word spread, more thousands came and established camps all around Boston. They besieged, laid siege to the British. You guys maybe have identified me as a history nerd. I get pretty passionate about some aspects of history. Well, this will confirm your opinion of me. I asked my wife to marry me on April 19th down in Tampa, Florida, on the beach as the sun was setting, 1996. Got down on one knee and asked her to marry me. She said yes, fortunately. I tried to schedule the wedding for April 19th. And then she started asking questions. She said, "What is it about April 19th that's so important?" And I said, "Well, that's the date of the first bloodshed of the American Revolution." She didn't think it was quite as romantic as I did. You say no? Needless to say, we did not get married on April 19th. It was a typical. Yeah. Well, once again, as chance would have it, those poor delegates had made their way back to Philadelphia to talk about tea when all of this was happening. The Second Continental Congress was meeting May of 1775. A messenger rode up and told them that there had been military conflict in Massachusetts between the militia and the British, that war had broken out. And even though they were there mostly to talk about tea, they decided to go ahead and take command of the army that had formed. Nobody gave the order. All those militia just camped out and besieged the British in Boston. But the Continental Congress agreed to take command of that impromptu army. And they didn't have too many people with military experience. George Washington had accidentally started the Great War for Empire back in 1754 with his rash attack on French troops. So they chose him as commander of what they now called the Continental Army. May 1775. But if you read through the transcripts of the Second Continental Congress, you will not see the word independence mentioned even once. Even with dead buried in the ground, blood on the ground, war between the American colonies and the British Empire, no one was talking or was willing to talk about independence. The goal still was to secure the rights of Englishmen under the English Constitution as part of the British Empire. Let's help me make sure I don't miss any dates, any months. May 1775, June July, August, September, October, November, December. That's a long time. Not a word was said about independence that whole time until January. 9 months later, January. This man, Thomas Paine, published a little pamphlet. A pamphlet is not a full book. It's just like it was only 42 pages long. You can make a pamphlet yourself by folding some note paper over and stapling in the middle. But he published a little pamphlet called Common Sense, putting forward the argument, quite simple, that the goal of all the fighting, the goal of the fighting should not be simply to remain in the British Empire with the rights of Englishmen. The goal of all the fighting, he said, in January 1776, that's the first date, January 10, when you might have been able to see it on a newsstand in Boston or New York. The goal of all the fighting should be independence, should be nationhood, to create a new nation separate from the British Empire. And that started the conversation. Once people saw that pamphlet and read through it, they began talking about independence. Even then, if you count forward the months, they started talking about it in January, February, March, April, May, June. It was another half year before they actually declared, before they were ready to declare independence in the summer of 1776. But the Common Sense started the conversation about independence